Hello and welcome to Roundel Round We Go, a podcast about London Underground. My name is Emily, I use she and they pronouns, and I am one of your hosts.
Hello, I'm Paul, I'm your other host, I use he and him pronouns, and on this podcast, in each episode we're going to discuss one of the stations on the London Underground. We're going to randomly pick a station each episode by drawing its name out of a bag. Now normally we would do that at the end of the previous episode, so we leave a bit of time for our audience to get in touch with us with any stories or information or exciting facts they've got about the station that's coming up next week. But because this is our very first episode, we're going to have to start by drawing out our first London Underground station name from the bag. So, Emily, are you ready to pick a name from the bag?
I'm ready, also a little bit terrified, but let's go.
Here we go.
Okay.
You're definitely ready now?
Yes, I'm ready. Let's
give it
shake
a good
this off
shake.
a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
You can hear the shaking. You can hear that this is legitimate. We're not using sound effects. I am literally picking one of these out. I'm a bit scared.
Which station do we have?
Hatton Cross.
Hatton Cross.
What do we know about Hatton Cross?
Hatton Cross. It's on the Piccadilly line.
It is on the Piccadilly line, and it's nearly at Heathrow. It's the last one before Heathrow, isn't it?
I think it is.
And it's got the,
It's the
branding from... It's got the green
It's
bird
the old,
things.
yeah, it's the old British Airways, I think, Speedbird logo
Yeah.
on platforms in mosaic,
Yeah, mosaic. It's orange and green, I believe. It's really beautiful.
and it's on that Heathrow extension that was built to serve the airport.
Okay,
Yeah.
too much information.
Okay.
We're going to do some research. We're going to come back and talk about it in more detail. All right, so we are ready to start our first podcast about Hatton Cross. We've done our research, which meant Paul has bought an obscene number of books about transport, and I have looked at the internet briefly. We're going to start each episode with a rundown of facts about the station, and Paul has the best announcer voice, so he is going to do that.
Hatton Cross is on the London Underground Piccadilly line. It opened on the 19th of July 1975. Hatton Cross is in Zone 5 and 6. It is in the London Borough of Hillingdon. In 2019, Hatton Cross had 3.24 million passengers. That's probably changed in the last year or so.
Just a tad.
Hatton Cross has absolutely no accessibility to anybody who can't use stairs. The station was designed by Sidney Hardy, who was the chief architect of London Transport. The name Hatton Cross originates from the Anglo-Saxon word hat, meaning heath, and tun, meaning settlement, giving us Hatton, and cross, referring to the road junction. So it means a road junction by the settlement on the heath. The buses which call at Hatton Cross are numbers 90, 203, 285, 423, 482, 490, H25, H26, and X26. And now for the next part. Emily, do you want to turn away and cover your ears?
Yes, this is for the labyrinths, the Mark Wallinger labyrinths, and I've been trying to find them all, but that's been hampered a bit by lockdown, so I don't want to know where they are. So if you also don't want to know where they are because you're also looking for them, you can fast forward about 15 seconds while Paul goes over it.
The labyrinth at Hatton Cross is number 267. It can be found in the ticket hall to the right of the gate line as you approach from the stairs to leave the station. There we go. You can uncover your ears now, Emily.
I sort of heard something about the right of something in the stairs, but I didn't get all of it, so it's okay.
That's the important thing.
All right, so we thought we'd start by talking about the design of the station, because it's quite interesting in that there's features that are kind of unique. Well, they are unique to the station, and that has a little bit to do with the history. So Hatton Cross was the first station in the Heathrow extension, and we're going to go into history later, but we wanted to look at some of the design features. I know I mentioned some of these when we drew Hatton Cross, but we're going to break those down in a little more detail.
Yeah, I think Hatton Cross is really interesting because it's one of the few tube stations that was built in the 1970s, so it is got a kind of style that you don't really find anywhere else on the London Underground.
Lots of orange, very 70s.
Indeed, exactly. And also quite a brutalist-looking concrete design, which it sort of fits in the middle between the older early 20th century sort of modernist designs, and then you've got the later Jubilee Line extension era where it becomes more postmodern. So the station, it was designed by Sidney Hardy, leading the London Transport Architects Department. It was in-house. They weren't contracting out to renowned architects like was the case when the Jubilee Line extension was designed later on. And they wanted to have a kind of bit of a departure from the style of the stations on the Victoria Line, which was built in the 1960s, when everything had been very, what we might consider now quite cold and bland, clinical, pale blues, greys.
It feels like it did have a bit of a throwback to things like Piccadilly line stations, the Leslie Green stations, the one with the tiles and the colors. I feel like they wanted to go more to that because you don't get so much of those at some place like Walthamstow Central on the Victoria line that is just so concrete. It feels like it has a little bit more of that
absolutely
color and homeliness.
Yeah. It's got more of that sort of character to it. Although actually you say that, it's interesting that they have at Hatton Cross the tiling on the platforms is a unique design for Hatton Cross, which is something that goes all the way back to the Leslie Green era of stations when they had the unique tiling on every single station platform, and that you still get on the Victoria Line stations as well. It is the very rare bit of decoration is they each have their own unique tiling patterns somewhere on the platforms. Yeah,
I used to change at Black Horse Road a lot, and there's the Black Horse on the platforms there. So I guess there's a bit of that thrown in, but it does feel, for those of you who have been to the station, it does feel a bit sort of warmer and more design heavy than Victoria Line stations, which only feel like they've got real design on the platforms.
Yeah, and then the idea with the Victoria Line stations was they thought, oh, it's the 1960s, people are all bright and colourful. They would be the ones who added colour to an otherwise fairly plain station. But of course, when everyone turns up in their winter coats in black, and back in those days in their probably bowler hats and suits, it didn't really work out quite as well.
Or
as
in the 1970s
planned.
when everyone's just wearing brown, they went, okay, we need to put some more colour in here.
Which will be more brown, but also some orange.
Yes. There's some like turquoise teal colour in there too.
There is as well. It is a colourful station, really.
It is.
And it's interesting what you're saying about it being a throwback to the earlier Piccadilly line designs, because of course Charles Holden, that famous London Underground architect of a lot of the modernist designs of the tube stations from the 20s through to the 40s, he designed stations which had a very kind of concrete box-like appearance when that was something really new and exciting. Places like Sudbury Town and Acton Town, and that's a theme which is continued with Hatton Cross. The booking hall of the station is a big concrete box with a high roof and a very airy space inside. So you've got that theme continuing.
Yeah, I don't think if we ever read anything that said that, but it feels like it's got this nice melding of different Piccadilly line ideas and designs that you get across the different stations. So the station itself, as we said, in-house design team with Sidney Hardy. But the actual design in the station, the tiling, is quite interesting.
Yes, when you get down to the platforms, they have tiling which was featuring this pattern. It's called the Speedbird, which is originally the logo of Imperial Airways, who were the sort of original British airline, and it was used by their successor, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, who eventually became British Airways and used the logo in their early days.
Apparently you need a funny voice to say.
Of course you need a funny voice to say British Overseas Airways Corporation. How could one possibly say that in a sensible voice?
And the interesting thing about this station was that it was open. So the Piccadilly line extension was going to go from Hounslow West, where the terminus originally was, out to Heathrow. But Hatton Cross opened first. I know we're going to get into the history later, but Hatton Cross opened first. And it was meant for just airline staff, wasn't it? It wasn't, passengers were still encouraged to take other services to get to Heathrow. So I guess that's why they had the...
Yeah. So it's serving the airline staff and people who work in the various of industrial estates around there that are all focused on serving Heathrow. So it's got that airline theme, but you wouldn't get the international passengers coming and going from Hatton Cross.
Other details which are really interesting. There are a lot of very minuscule design details which are really interesting about this station. So you've got external illuminated roundels, which are quite rare. They're also at Pimlico, isn't it? Yeah.
No, that's the internal ones.
Okay, so you've got the external illuminated roundels, which actually are more common, I think.
Well, now you see the ones at Hatton Cross are, I think, a unique 1970s design where they're like almost standard shop front style, like square boxes that stick out from the side of the roof with the roundel on, rather than being the whole sign is the roundel shape.
Yeah, we highly encourage you to look this up wherever you can find pictures. So yes, you've got internal illuminated roundels on the platforms, which are only also at Pimlico and in the Pic Memorial at Piccadilly Circus.
Yeah, because it used to be a feature of, I think all the Victoria Line stations had the illuminated roundels, but they've all disappeared over the years.
They're quite pretty, but they do have a sort of 70s feel. What else did we have? We have the hanging basket hangers. Yep. So there's hanging baskets outside, or are they still there?
I think there's just the hangers, but not the baskets now.
Okay,
which is a bit of a pity.
They get rid of all the floral details. But so there's roundels on the external hanging baskets. What else have we got there?
Oh, so when you go into the station, because it was designed as the airport station, they wanted to make sure that they would limit the amount of noise from outside getting in. So that's actually a bit of a, I'm not entirely sure about this, whether they were originally rotating doors or originally sliding doors. There seems to be some slightly differing sources on which one it was. But anyway, the doors as you go in have roundel-shaped handles to push them open.
Which is pretty fun. Yes, that is pretty exciting.
And they are still there.
If you do know those facts, please send us an email, tweet us. We do encourage people to get in touch nicely and give us some corrections if you do know this information for sure. And we also are going to, if you check our podcast notes, we've got all the sources we've used, so you can check things there. I like the fact that the ticket hall doors were possibly rotating to keep out aircraft noise, if that's true, but it might not be true.
Well, I've seen a diagram of the station from when it was being built which shows the rotating doors, but I've also got the original souvenir book that was given out when the Heathrow station first opened, which says it's electric sliding doors. So
was that an architectural model though? Was that the dream and then they didn't have the budget to make that happen?
It's possible that or they decided rotating doors would be impractical, or I don't know.
I went to the station maybe when we could still travel places, probably Christmas 2019, when I was walking the London Loop, and they definitely didn't look like there was any evidence of sliding doors, but it wasn't something I was looking for. Have we got anything else on the design before we go into history?
The roof of the station is quite interesting, which is perhaps not an expected statement, but there is a story that the roof was designed to withstand a jumbo jet crashing into it, and indeed it is a massive solid-looking concrete slab of a roof. And that would seem like a practical thing to do, given it is right next to Heathrow Airport, but the more authoritative sources seem to indicate it was actually just designed to bear the weight of a proposed rooftop car park, which is rather more boring and never seems to have actually been.
I mean, it does make sense. There'd be a lot of people commuting to work around there that would want to have that.
Absolutely. And the roof is actually architecturally interesting as well, because it's got this concrete frieze all the way around the edge of it, designed by an artist called William Mitchell, who seemed to have been quite renowned for his concrete artworks back in the 1970s.
There seems to be a lot of people who were big into concrete,
It was the dumb thing.
It was modernism, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit in the first bit where we were talking about design, but essentially the Piccadilly line since 1925 used to terminate at Hounslow West, and this extension was approved in the 1960s and 1967 to go out. It's just two stations. So it went from Hounslow West, it was going to go to Hatton Cross, obviously what we're talking about now, and then out to Heathrow Central. So there wasn't more than one station at Heathrow like there is today. Before this, if you wanted to go to the airport, there were sort of various options that none of which were great. They were all bus-based. And as much as I love buses, that might not be the most efficient way when you're trying to catch a plane. I mean, admittedly, at the time, catching a plane there wasn't as much sort of rigmarole with it as there is now, obviously for good safety reasons, but still. But you had to get a bus from either a central London terminal or there was a bus that went from Hounslow West. Which one was it, Paul?
Bus A1.
Okay, the A1 bus you could get from Hounslow West out to Heathrow. But this was going to be a game changer for getting people to the airport, particularly for people visiting London. It would make things so much easier for them. So they started work on the site on the 28th of April, 1971. And they had the then leader of the Greater London Council, Desmond come out. And it was a big sort of showy thing. He had the excavator. He was going to start on the construction. It was a sort of symbolic opening ceremony kind of thing. But then they realized that they weren't really ready to do that. So it was a while before they started constructing it. Paul's going to talk about construction because he knows more about construction than me.
Yep. So after Desmond Plummer came and did his fancy first bucket of soil with the excavator, the British Airports Authority, who ran Heathrow, insisted that the soil be put back within half an hour because, in fact, they had to spend the first year or so doing diversion of all the underground utility services, the water pipes and electricity mains and that kind of thing, before the proper construction of the extension could start. And the extension running from Hounslow West as far as Hatton Cross was built using the cut and cover method, which goes all the way back to the very first days of the tube. In fact, before it was the tube, when it was...
not technically the tube, if anyone is very pedantic on that point.
Indeed, for us London Underground pedants, the Metropolitan line and the District line, when they were first built, they were cut and cover lines where you dig a trench down from the surface, put the roof over the top of it and build a railway in it to make a tunnel, which was rather disruptive when you were building it round central London, but turned out to be the cheap way to do it when you're building an extension far out in London suburbs. And the technique used to build the tunnel for the extension from Hounslow to Hatton Cross was a bit different from what they'd used for the Metropolitan line, the District line, all the way back in the 1860s, because they actually wanted to be considerate and limit the amount of noise caused to all the residents living nearby to the construction works. So what they did was, along the route of the railway, they dug down a trench about a metre deep for the whole width of the railway tunnel that would be down to just the depth of where the roof of the tunnel would eventually be. And then along either side of that trench, they used boring machines to drill down vertical holes that went from the bottom of the trench down to the level at which the railway track would eventually be, which was several metres underneath the ground. And those holes would then all be filled up with concrete to form what are known as concrete piles. And when you've got a whole load of those in a row along either side of where the tunnel would be, it forms the concrete walls that would eventually be the walls of the railway tunnel. And on top of those concrete walls, they then built the roof of the tunnel, which was effectively just concrete beams laid at the bottom of that trench that they'd already dug. And then they used diggers underneath the roof to dig out all the soil that was under there. And by using the diggers to excavate the soil underneath this concrete roof that they'd already put in place, it limited the amount of noise that was escaping out into all the residents around. So it was a really very effective way to build a tunnel while being considerate of the neighbours nearby.
Yeah, that sounds like a really quite... I mean, maybe they were doing it in other places. Maybe it was something... I don't know how widespread that technique was, but it sounds really innovative. My question... So... was the tunnel circular or was it square? Because my picturing of that is that that would be a square tunnel.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a big rectangular tunnel with the two tracks running next to each other. And you're right that it's quite an innovative idea. And in fact, the winning contractor of the construction hadn't proposed that idea. They'd proposed using, I think, metal piles, which were going to be really expensive and noisy, and this idea was come up with by one of the losing contractors who then got hired as a subcontractor to do this bit of the work because their idea was so good. So it really was a bit of a groundbreaking construction methodology.
That's a good pun there. I appreciate that groundbreaking pun. Thank you for that. We needed that in this podcast. So my thought when I heard that this was done as cut and cover was that it would be because it was such a short extension. They were going, well, at the time, only one station from Hounslow East to Hatton Cross and then one more on to Heathrow. So I thought, it's short, it can be cut and cover, that's fine. But actually, that's not the case.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a mixture of, it was just a very short extension, but they also used the cut and cover technique for it, partly because using boring machines would have meant the station would have been much deeper, which would meant you'd need escalators down from the surface. That would cost more money. Be a bit less convenient for the passengers. It was cheaper overall to build a cut and cover railway rather than a bored railway. And also it did turn out to be really convenient because when they were constructing the extension from Hounslow to Hatton Cross and then onwards to Heathrow, it was exactly the same time as what was then called the Fleet Line, what we now know as the first stage of the Jubilee Line, down from Baker Street then originally to Charing Cross Station was being built. And that was using all of the specialist construction workers who were really experienced at digging really deep tube tunnels. So there wouldn't have been anyone available to build this Heathrow extension had they been trying to use deep underground tunnel boring. They were all over on the Fleet line. So very handy, they used the much simpler cut and cover technique for this.
Yeah.
You actually had some builders to build it for you.
The station itself is interesting in terms of its construction, simply because being so close to an airport is kind of an issue.
Yeah, that presented a few challenges, because just like for the extension, the first bit of the extension running from Hounslow to Hatton Cross, it was dug using the cut and cover method. It's basically a big concrete box dug down from the surface. But they wanted to put the walls in using the piling machines, just like they had for the railway tunnel. But the piling machines are normally really tall. And in fact, they're so tall that British Airports Authority said, no, actually, they'll be too big to have right next to an airport with the aeroplanes taking off and landing. So what the Underground did was they had to effectively dig down 3 metres from the surface just using normal diggers to create a sort of shallow, wide trench across the entire width of where the station would be. And then at the bottom of this sort of big hole, that's where they would park the piling machines, which had also been specially modified to make them a bit shorter than normal. And then those piling machines sitting in the bottom of a hole could put in the walls of the station, sort of hammered down from the surface along the edges of the trench, without causing any interference to all the planes flying above. And that created this big box for the station, which you could then put all the platforms into.
All the platforms. There's 2 platforms.
Both the platforms
yes,
into.
It's not quite all the platforms. It gives it a bit of an impression. It's a lot bigger than it is. So the opening of Hatton Cross actually was kind of comical in a way. It feels like, to me, saying you're not going to celebrate your birthday, but then commandeering the after-work drinks to be about your birthday and bringing a cake. So, yeah, they didn't want to have any ceremony. They said, oh, this is just another thing we're doing. I'm sure there were some transport geeks like us very excitedly there at Hounslow Rest, ready to go. But there was a little bit of ceremony.
There was a little bit of ceremony because, as you say, they commandeered it as the first public run for the brand new 1973 stock tube trains, which were the brand new Piccadilly line trains that had been built specially for the line when it was being extended to Heathrow. They had the feature of having slightly longer carriages. They had a little tiny bit of space for luggage room next to the doors, although nowhere near enough luggage room until the trains were massively refurbished.
There's still nowhere near enough luggage room. If you're on a busy train to Heathrow, it's, very crowded.
Yeah, but the first train to run into Hatton Cross on the 19th of July 1975 was the first public service of the new 1973 stock, which are named after the year in which they were supposed to be sort of introduced to service, but obviously that was a little bit late, being in 1975, and then it went a bit later because they then hid the 1973 stock trains away again for another month, and they didn't re-enter public service until the 18th of August 1975, when they actually went into sort of full fleet passenger service. And the other trains being used on the Piccadilly line at the time, before the 1973 stock, included the really ancient 1938 stock trains, which you may know as the ones that the London Transport Museum has one of the preserved examples of. Beautiful red historic tube trains with kind of wonderful Art Deco interior with the glorious glass lampshades and all those sorts of features, lots of bare wood on the inside. Really wonderful trains to ride on.
No one romanticizes trains like you, Paul. It's the most beautiful period-esque vision of a train, these 1938 stocks. But we have been on 1938 stocks on the Isle of Wight, and they sadly went out of service there. When we went in October, which was a time you were allowed to travel, I'm sure I saw at least 35 people. There were people from Northern Ireland. I saw like a big group of them. Yeah, people taking photos. I mean, Paul, you were taking hundreds of photos, and there was a large group of people with you doing so. So yeah, there's a lot of enthusiasm about those particular trains.
They are trains that a lot of people love, and you could have ridden one to Hatton Cross because they ran on the Piccadilly line up until December 1975, once the station had already opened. They actually had Heathrow destination boards made for the 1938 trains on the Piccadilly line, but they never ran to Heathrow Station because they'd been withdrawn before it opened.
Oh, it's like Crossrail signage in stations.
It's a little bit like that. And actually, I kind of tell a lie because they have run to Heathrow, because the Transport Museum's preserved 1938 stock has run on the Piccadilly line all the way to Heathrow and round the loop, and I've been on one of those, and that was great fun.
So a heritage service has run there.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that counts as
no, not
those,
entirely.
Yeah.
But the fun thing is that a lot of the tourists who just arrived at Heathrow Station from the plane didn't realise it was a heritage service, so as we trundled through very slowly without stopping, in this ancient train, there were a bunch of people with massive suitcases kind of jogging along the platform trying to keep up with where they thought the doors would stop, and then of course the train just kept on going and they were left looking a bit confused.
I love that idea of people arriving to London from somewhere like, oh, I don't know, Shanghai or something that has such modern transport, and seeing this 1938 train and just thinking, oh, is it really this backwards here?
They might have been transport enthusiasts who are going, oh my goodness, wow, look at this amazing train, I want to catch this one. And that's why they were jogging after it.
I can understand why they might have enthusiasm for it, but if you've never been to London before, you just see a train and think, that's the train I'm going to get on. The other thing, I guess, in terms of being around the airport is the free travel zone, which is an interesting one. So the Heathrow free travel zone no longer exists. I didn't know this until I was looking this up. It was stopped because of COVID. Essentially, it's sponsored by the airport and it was costing too much money to have the free travel zone. But for those unaware, the free travel zone means that you can travel on the tube between airport terminals with the different Heathrow. Obviously, there was just Heathrow Central at one time, but now with the 3 different Heathrow stations for free. But Hatton Cross is slightly an oddity. It is sort of in the free travel zone, but it's not really. If you enter and exit the station at Hatton Cross, you will have to pay, but you can go to Hatton Cross to get off the train and get back on the train to go to a different airport terminal, and it also falls within the free bus zone as part of Heathrow, so you can take buses for free around Heathrow. When I was riding all the buses in London, I would do this for fun and I enjoyed it, and some of them will say, end of free travel zone, you are entering the free travel zone. It was a lot of fun, but alas, the free travel zone no longer exists. We hope maybe it will come back, although to be honest, I'm not sure it's necessarily that useful, but it's a nice thing. Free travel is always a nice thing, isn't it?
Of course, yes. And it's intriguing talking about the buses around Heathrow, because when Hatton Cross was opened back in 1975, the London Transport ran that A1 bus from Hounslow West to Heathrow, and they kept on running that from Hounslow West. They encouraged people not to get off at Hatton Cross if they wanted to go to Heathrow, until the actual Heathrow station was opened a couple of years later in 1977.
Yeah, the thing about Hatton Cross is that it's right by Heathrow. When you get out there, you're like, the airport is right beside you. But it's not really that accessible. I mean, the airport would have obviously been very different in the 70s, a lot smaller than it is now, but it doesn't feel very accessible. I don't even know how one would walk there, and it's so industrial around there, so you wouldn't necessarily want to do that. So you essentially have to take a bus from there. I took a lot of buses from Hatton Cross to Heathrow in kind of loops from there. So one of the things that we want to get into that's kind of history, but a little bit wider than history about Hatton Cross, is the fact that we saw in many of the bits of research we were doing that said at the time Hatton Cross was opened, there were more stations than any other time on the history of the Underground. And immediately you think that doesn't make a lot of sense because more stations open, but of course lots of stations close and a lot of stations were transferred to other lines. So when we read that, I said, that's a cool fact. And Paul said, well, we need to actually look into that in more detail because he takes nothing as read. So I am now looking in front of us at a spreadsheet that Paul has painstakingly made of all the openings and closings. And in fact, I'm recording this for a second time because Paul stopped me because he wasn't happy that he didn't have an exact date for the closure of 2 stations and wanted to make sure it was accurate because he is that level of pedant. And so he's going to go into his process in determining whether or not this fact is true.
Yeah, what really surprised me was especially that it was 279 stations with Hatton Cross opening on the 19th of July 1975. That's claimed to be the largest number ever on the London Underground. And I thought, well, hang on, it was only 2 years later that Heathrow Central opened. Shouldn't that take it up to 280? What happened between then? So I looked into all the details and I came up with this spreadsheet. And I started off with, we take it for read that it was 279 stations as this fact claimed. And I'd see if we counted from then onwards through to today, when we know that there are 270 stations on the Underground, would all the openings and closings get us neatly from 279 to 270, or would there be some error and therefore the fact would be wrong? So we start off with Hatton Cross opening, 279 stations, and then only a few months later, on the 3rd and 4th of October 1975, the Northern City line, which had been part of London Underground, was transferred to British Rail ownership, with Essex Road and Drayton Park Station being lost, and that's why it went down to 277 stations, which meant that when in December of 1977 Heathrow Central opened, we were then only up to 278 stations. So then, a couple of years after that, 2nd of November 1981, Blake Hall, which was a station on the Ongar branch of the Central Line, closed. That takes us all the way down to 277 stations. Few years after, 1 year after that, on the 24th of September 1982, the Bakerloo line stopped serving all the way from Stonebridge Park to Watford Junction. So we lost 11 stations: Wembley Central, North Wembley, South Kenton, Kenton, Harrow and Wheelstone, Headstone Lane, Hatch End, Carpenter's Park, Bushey, Watford High Street and Watford Junction all lost their Bakerloo line service in 1982, down to 266. But then, 2 years later, in 1984, the Bakerloo line resumed service from Stonebridge Park to Harrow and Wheelstone, which meant Wembley Central, North Wembley, South Kenton, Kenton and Harrow and Wheelstone all rejoined the London Underground, and we got back up to 271 stations.
It was a brief break from having those stations, you know. They thought, okay, we can come back now.
Yeah, so in fact 266 stations, which was the number with that section all the way from Stonebridge Park to Watford Junction having been lost, was the low point for London Underground stations in this whole period from 1975 to the present day. And actually that was the number of stations that we had. So we got up to 271 stations. Then in 1986, Heathrow Terminal 4 station opened. That took us up to 272. Then we go down again in 1994 because on the 30th of September, both Aldwych station closed on its little branch of the Piccadilly line and the rest of the Ongar line closed. So North Weald station and Ongar station both closed on the Central line.
Okay, I want you to take a breath for a second and everyone keep this in their heads because we're going fast and furious through the rest of these.
So we lost 3 stations. That took us down to 269. From that point onwards, we go up again because in 1999, the Jubilee Line extension opens. So that starts off on the 14th of May 1999 with Canning Town and North Greenwich. We're up to 271. On the 19th of August, Canada Water Station opened. We're at 272. On the 17th of September, Bermondsey and Canary Wharf opened. We're up to 274. And then on the 20th of November, finally Southwark Station opened, and we're up to 275 with the complete Jubilee Line extension now operational. And then things go down again because the East London line starts to transfer from London Underground to what's now London Overground operation. That began on the 9th of June of 2006 with Shoreditch Station closing, down to 274. On the 22nd of December 2007, the entire rest of the East London line moved away from London Underground. So New Cross Gate, Surrey Quays, Rotherhithe, Wapping and Shadwell stations. That takes us down to 268. We're nearly there. 27th of March 2008, Heathrow Terminal 5 station opened. We're up to 279. And then finally, 12th of October 2008, Wood Lane station opens on the Central Line to serve the Westfield Shopping Centre. And that brings us up to the magic number of 270. And there we are.
Yes, Paul, but Wood Lane is not on the Central Line. I think you'll find it's on the Circle Line and the Hammersmith and City. It's White City that's on the
Did I
Central.
say that?
Maybe
You're right, I did say Central Line.
So, yes, my favorite fact about this whole thing is that Paul did all this work and he kept saying, I'm one off. This can't be right because I'm one off. And I took one look at the spreadsheet and said, where's Canary Wharf? And he did all this work. And I figured it out in the end. So that's, me taking credit for Paul doing a lot of work, which I feel like is a lot of this podcast. You've also included beautifully in this spreadsheet the other stations that will be opening. So Nine Elms and Battersea Power Station, which I refuse to call anything else. And then, of course, possibly the Bakerloo extension.
Yeah, I was trying to work out, will we ever get back to 279 stations again? So when the Northern Line extension opens, which is supposed to happen later this year, 2021, we should get 2 more stations. That'll get us to 272. If, hypothetically, the Bakerloo Line extension goes ahead, which probably won't be till the 2030s, we'll get another 4 stations. Old Kent Road 1, possibly known as Burgess Park. Old Kent Road 2, possibly known just as Old Kent Road. New Cross Gate Station and Lewisham Station. That'll get us up to 276. If we want to get to 279 again, we'll probably need a second phase of the Bakerloo Line extension, taking over the Hayes branch on Network Rail, and that'll get us well up into the 280s somewhere.
I mean, I do predict a time somewhere in the future when Crossrail is open as the Elizabeth Line. I think there might be, I know right now it is not technically a London Underground line, but I feel like sort of like that tradition of things like the Metropolitan line, it could become one of them. I know that the structures around it are different, but I feel like some kind of time in the future, it will be considered a London Underground line, which would boost us by an awful lot. So we can see if that happens. Now, Paul has gone through those so painstakingly, and I am sure he is accurate and he has used every piece of information out there. But should someone know something else or think something else, please get in touch and correct us. We like learning. So if you've got some facts that counter what we've got to say, please let us know. But I'm 99% certain. How certain are you? I mean, I'm 99% certain Paul is correct and he did all the research. How certain are you, Paul? Because you did it yourself.
I think given that you spotted Canary Wharf and it now does get us on to 270 where it ought to be, I'm pretty certain we've got the right sequence of events there. But yeah.
Obviously, I can name one station, so it's all right now.
If anyone can spot any errors in our dates and numbers of stations there, I'm always open to anyone who's got better London Underground knowledge than us.
So for our last bit of each podcast, before we go on to drawing the following episode's station, what we want to do is a section called Onward Connections, which is kind of my thing because I love buses and I had ridden all the buses in London and then I was going to catch up. Let's not get into it. It's pandemic related. I need to ride some more buses when I can. But I want to talk about where you can get to from each station not using the underground. So obviously this station not having national rail connections. I'm going to talk about buses, but if we're talking about Paddington or King's Cross or something, we might talk about national rail destinations or something like that. And so for this one, I thought, let's look at these buses. I mean, we had a conversation together about the buses, and I think our decision, the best onward connection here was the X26 bus. Now, X buses are rare in London. These are express buses that don't stop that often, and the X26 is the longest bus route in London. It goes from Heathrow, I don't know which terminal at Heathrow actually, but it goes from Heathrow to West Croydon. And I am forever the cynic about Croydon. I think I'm too mean about Croydon, in fact. But there is actually, West Croydon has got a lot of interesting things going on in it right now, not to mention the fact that they have a What the Pita, which, I mean, we're not advertising for them, but I am obsessed with What the Pita vegan pitas. But I think just the fact that it is the longest bus route in London, historically interesting, actually used to be a much, much longer bus route. If you look on Bus Wiki, there is a extremely detailed page about this bus route, which, as Paul said, is either incredible bus fan fiction or is accurate. I mean, it's not cited, but to have this much level of detail, you either have to be trolling everyone who wants to look at Bus Wiki or it has to be accurate. And so I think it's an interesting route to take even if you're not the biggest bus fan, it's going fast, it's stopping all over the place, it's going throughout South London, well, West and South London. So it's just an interesting route to take, and a nice little adventure, and sort of a piece of London bus, I want to say infrastructure. My brain is not working for
It is a
one.
remnant of that whole London country bus system that used to exist that would take people way out beyond the city into the countryside, that very little of still exists today.
Yeah, there's a few of them, but this one is, it's a nice route to explore that, and it's a double-decker, so you can sit at the front and enjoy the view. So that would be the best option for one to take. A small side note, there's no night buses from Hatton Cross, which is interesting, but I guess no one really needs to get there at night because there's people taking the night buses to the airport, but not Hatton Cross. So I thought that's just a bit of a weird one, no night buses.
You'd think the airport workers and the people on the industrial estates would benefit from a night bus.
But I guess the airport workers now tend to actually just go to the airport.
Yeah, I guess.
So, I think we will leave it there, and we will go on to picking our next week's station, which is very exciting. All right, so we've covered Hatton Cross.
That's station 1 done.
Yes, and we're going to draw our next station, and I want to do it because it's my favorite bit. It's the fun bit.
So, drum roll time.
Yeah, there's so many stations in this bag, and I'm going to pick this one. Oh, I just dropped that one, so I'm not going to pick that one. Okay, what have we got here? Ooh, this is a fun choice.
Ooh.
Earl's Court.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, Earl's Court. So what do we know about Earl's Court?
Well, what do we know about Earl's Court?
So there's the exhibition centre.
Yep.
And there was... What about the balloon? Was there something...
The big wheel. There was the giant Ferris wheel that was constructed at Earl's Court sometime 1900-ish.
Yes. Also, District Line shooting off in lots of ways, including to Kensington, Olympia, which is an interesting little journey of its own.
Yep. Piccadilly line as well.
Of course, Piccadilly line, yeah.
First escalator. It was the first escalator on the tube back in 1911.
Yes, it was. And I remember going to see steam trains run through there. There's a TARDIS outside. Earl's Court, that is I'm picking very well, Paul.
You're doing
doing
well.
A good job.
You're our lucky charm here.
Watch, next one's going to be the middle of nowhere, and we aren't even going to know what line the station is on. All right, so we are going to go off and do some research, and then we will go back for episode 2 on Earl's Court Station. We've done it. We've made it to the end of our first episode. Thank you for joining us and listening. We hope you enjoyed it. This podcast is a labor of love by us, by me, Emily Turner.
And me, Paul Burkitt-Gray.
We do everything. What do we do, Paul?
We research it, we produce it, we present it.
We edit it, we figure out how to everything works. So yeah, we do everything on it. So we appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, let us know. Please share it. You can get in touch with us on Instagram and Twitter at roundleroundpod, or you can email us at roundleroundpod@gmail.com. Rate us, review us, share us with your friends if you enjoy the podcast.
The only thing we didn't do is design the logo.
Oh, you're right. We didn't design the logo. That is by the wonderful Colleen McIsaac. You can find their work at Little Foible Art on Instagram. Now, that's the end of our show and the credits, but we have a lot of sources we used, and we would feel remiss if we didn't credit all those sources. So Paul is going to read out our list of sources for this episode.
Absolutely. The books we used in researching episode 1 on Hatton Cross are The Piccadilly Line, A Brief History by Charles E. Lee, The Piccadilly Tube, The First 100 Years by Mike Horne, The Piccadilly Line, An Illustrated History by Desmond Croome, Rails Through the Clay, A History of London's Tube Railways by Alan Arthur Jackson and Desmond F. Croome, A Guide to Modernism in Metroland by Joshua Abbott, Underground Movement by Paul Moss, Building London's Underground by Anthony Badsey Ellis, Underground Architecture by David Lawrence, Tube Station Trivia by Jeff Marshall, The Moving Metropolis, A History of London's Transport Since 1800 by David Lawrence. Labyrinth, A Journey Through London's Underground by Tamsin Dillon, Will Self, Mark Wallinger, Marina Warner, Christian Wilmar and Louise Koish. Why Do Shepherds Need a Bush? London's Underground History of Tube Station Names by David Hilliam. What's in a Name? Origins of Station Names on the London Underground by Cyril M. Harris. We also used the map of the London Underground called the London Underground, A Diagrammatic History by Douglas Rose, and the websites Ian Visits, Pastscape, and Modernism in Metroland. And from the Transport for London website, the Underground Idiom Design Guide PDF document. Links to all of those documents and websites and the full details of the publishers of all the books should hopefully be in the full episode notes.
Fantastic. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope you're back next week when we explore Earl's Court.